Okay, wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am so happy to introduce Ife Thompson, who is an award-nominated UK-based community activist, United Nations Fellow, a Black history expert, museum curator, barrister, and writer. Ife campaigns for the protection and fulfillment of the human rights of people of African descent in the United Kingdom. Ife has also founded 2 civil society organizations, and we are happy to welcome her here on this Pulse Community session.
Hi, happy to be here as well.
Thank you so much. So we're just gonna get started and dive right in, and just start with basically an introduction. If you, Ife, if you could just explain to us more about what the International Decade for People of African Descent is and what it is about.
So yes, the International Decade for People of African Descent started in 2015 and runs to 2024, and it's a UN created mandate. And the aim of the decade is to promote, respect, and protect the fulfillment of all the human rights and fundamental freedoms of people of African descent, as recognized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the UN General Assembly passed the resolution 6827 to get the decade up and running. And the themes of the decade are justice, recognition, and development for people of African descent. And the decade is really a timely reminder. It's a really unique opportunity to look at the contributions made by people of African descent to our society and to propose concrete measures to promote equality, combat discrimination of any kind that is currently hindering the full protection and enjoyment of human rights of people of African descent. So in proclaiming the decade, the UN is really, alongside with the international community, recognizing that people of African descent are a distinct group whose human rights must be protected and promoted. And particularly the UN really draws upon the fact that what interrupted the full protection of Black people's human rights was the transatlantic slave trade. So it really understands the ongoing effects of slave trade and colonization and the racial hierarchy created white supremacy and how that continues to affect Black people today. So the UN is using its time and its work on human rights to really, shadow in on this issue. And I think it's very timely because we've had BLM 2020 for more of us to be using the program activities and the mandates required by the decade to promote and to protect the human rights of people of African descent. So I think it's a really useful framework for us to be using as we are pushing back against anti-Blackness that's worldwide.
Mm-hmm. That's phenomenal. That sounds really fantastic. And I mean, we'll get more into it, but it'll be quite interesting to see how the work that yourself and other activists and individuals involved in this process do, I guess, as it now is nearing its end, because I believe or the decade comes to an end in 2024. Yeah, I guess then my next question, more specifically about the decade for people of African descent, would just be along the lines of, what does the UN want member states to work on? What have we been seeing them do in the decade started in 2014 until now? And then what are, I guess, the goals and hopes for the remaining few years that are left?
Yeah, so the decade, obviously with most things at a UN level, it is definitely up to states to engage with the decade. So what we have is that some states have recognized the decade and actually celebrate the decade. Unfortunately, the UK has declined to recognize and celebrate the decade, which is, really, really, I guess the true fashion, true nature of Britishness in terms of trying to ignore the issues it's created, particularly around the transatlantic slave trade, trying to hide its involvement in empire. So the decision to not celebrate the decade is, kind of classic British behavior in terms of trying to ignore or trying to almost, to an extent, throw it under the carpet, you could say, in terms of its involvement and its role in actually continuing to violate people of African descent rights and its history and its role as a major player, as one of the key proponents in transatlantic slave trade and the ongoing degradation of Black people's lives globally. So that's one thing to just note. But in terms of how the UN wants states to engage, they have said that what states should be doing is following the program activities. So under the 3 themes of the program activity, as I had mentioned, recognition, justice and development. I've just got some examples of some of the themes underneath the program activities. So looking at recognition, there's a whole section called right to equality and non-discrimination. It says that states should remove all obstacles that prevent the equal enjoyment of all human rights, economic, social, cultural, civic, and political, including the right to development of people of African descent. So under the theme of justice, they've got some examples of states designing and implementing and enforcing effective measures to eliminate the phenomenon known as racial profiling, which we know has devastating effects on people of African descent. It curtails a number of other human rights, the right to privacy, the right to non-discrimination, and so on and so forth. And it propels Black people into the criminal justice system because we're constantly criminalized, and therefore we're constantly chastised for being Black. And then we have another point mentioned in the program activities for the whole decade, which includes stuff for the state and also stuff for international community, eliminating institutional stereotypes concerning people of African descent, and applying appropriate sanctions to law enforcement officials who act on the basis of racial profiling. And what we see again and again is that law enforcement get away with these sort of acts with impunity. So the decade is really trying to ensure that states are putting accountability mechanisms in, putting in protection mechanisms in, and doing things to redress the harms that have been created by anti-Blackness globally. And another, the last theme of the decade is development. So they've got some examples in development. States should take measures to improve the quality of health service to people of African descent. So we know in the UK, Black women are 5 times more likely to die during childbirth. And the NHS have said they have nothing in place to try and fix that. So that's just not good enough. So we can see the decade is really pinpointing on these issues. Again, they've got a section in development under education, taking measures to ensure public and private education systems do not discriminate or exclude children of African descent, and they are protected from direct and indirect discrimination. So what with my work that I do with BLAM, we see a lot of hair policing of Black children excluded for wearing their afros, Black children excluded for taking part in culturally specific behaviors like kissing their teeth, which is something that's very cultural, which would, I guess, the cultural equivalent to the UK is maybe hissing or huffing. But we are then given detentions and having to face indirect discrimination because of the way in which our cultural customs are perceived and demonized. So those are some of the examples. But a real theme around the program activities is for states to, one, recognize and actually follow the Durban Declaration of activities, because in 2001 they did have the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, etc. And there was a comprehensive document created within that program activities that states should have been following in their desire to combat racism. And also the UN is calling on states to effectively implement ICED, which is the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The UK has ratified that convention, but they haven't ensured that it's enshrined in UK domestic law. So in terms of being able to hold the state to account for its failings, particularly directly using that convention, is very difficult. So in terms of strengthening people of African sensibility to use those frameworks, but also there's a very, very clear mandate in ICED of how states can deal with racism. It talks about nullifying and eradicating policies that have a discriminatory effect. So a lot of policies would be wiped out the window, with that notion. So you've got the whole stop and search under Section 60, which disproportionately affects people of African descent in the UK. If we had a government that was following its legal obligations under ICED, then we would see that such laws would be completely scrapped because of their discriminatory effect. So in terms of being able to engage with instruments that the UN already has, particularly under ICED, particularly under the Durban Declaration, the international decade is working with that as a framework for states to already be using, and it gives also further guidance of how they can obviously make some of the work they're doing specific to people of African descent, and it gives a number of different program activities, a number of things that you can do, particularly even around history, recognizing, preserving the history of people of African descent. But we find, in the UK, we see that we don't learn Black history. We see that the Black history we learn is American history. Again, the British state is trying to, again, absolve itself from any responsibility in terms of empire, and also the effects and just the barbarism of transatlantic slave trade. This inability to teach it in schools, this inability to also showcase people of African descent's history prior to European contact, because our history didn't start with European contact. So in terms of being truthful and ensuring that we are actively showcasing Black British narratives and people of African descent narratives globally, particularly the ones that connect Africa and also the Caribbean to the UK, we don't see that being done. So the decade really goes into specific ways in which states can actually work towards ensuring the human rights of people of African descent are being respected and being promoted in the UK.
That's really interesting, and I do hope that over the next couple of years, we do see that engagement, and that the labor that yourself and others are putting in is hopefully, comes to fruition, and at least more enshrinement of these international conventions. So I think my next question then would be, how does the decade aim to, I think you did actually quite cover how the decade aims to kind of improve justice and access to justice, but if you just briefly kind of state how specifically maybe that could come to fruition, or that is maybe already coming to fruition in the context of the United Kingdom.
So in terms of justice, particularly under the ISAD Convention, since the decade actually, and in light of the decade, they have a recommendation 34 that's come about, recommendations by the UN's ISAD Third Committee, as we call it. It is just recommendations of how states should interpret their legal obligations, not necessarily binding, but they have one just for people of African descent, looking at ways in which states can better protect people of African descent. So there is that states can use as a guiding force, particularly in line with their legal obligations. And then we have recommendation 36 as well, which is looking at specifically racial profiling. And again, we know racial profiling disproportionately affects people of African descent globally. So there are mechanisms that are being created that are there for states to use to help them understand and actually see what they can be doing to ensure the justice system is fairer. I mean, in the UK, we have had many reports. We've had the McPherson report, which was as far back as the 90s. And we've had, again, the Lamy Review in 2017, which talked about and really showcased how even outside the police and the justice system itself, from, from the inception of when somebody enters justice system, they are entering a system that discriminates against them. So we know that, Black people are more likely to be in prison for the same offence that a white person's committed. And again, we have the same issues in terms of lack of bail being given to Black defendants. So there's real ongoing effects in terms of who is seen as vulnerable, who is seen as criminal, and who is then deemed worthy of punishment. So what we are seeing in particular is that all this content has been there, all the reports have been written. It's just there's a lack of willingness from the state to implement these recommendations that would work towards ensuring that Black lives are mattering in the justice system. So I do think there is certainly a colorblind approach to dealing with issues, but when we have that sort of approach, we don't actually see how race does affect our lives and kind of act like race isn't there when it is there. One, we are not being truthful because we do see race because race is there, but in seeing race we need to understand the historical context of race in order to ensure that we're not going forward with, and continuing historical harms. So I do think that there is a lot out there. There is, the UN decade has been going since 2015, and the BLM movement happened in 2020. So in terms of this work being around and this information being around, Durban Declaration was created in 2001. And it talks about these things. So this is not a new phenomenon, because racism is not a new phenomenon. So I do think that there has been work done and things that states can implement, but there's just a lack of willingness to actually deal with the problem. So what we're seeing is that this structural racism is left intact, and the state is continuing its harms against people of African descent, and they're not receiving any reprimand for doing so. So in terms of being complicit and actually creating policies and mechanisms that will continually allow Black people and people of African descent to be harmed, we're seeing the state is just complicit in doing that, and the state is not necessarily doing anything to rectify harms created by policies that is put forward that are allowing these issues to continue to thrive in society.
Definitely. A lot more does need to be done in improving, I think, access to and the quality of justice that people receive. So then I think my next question on kind of the decade is, what exactly is your role as a fellow, or how do you view your role as a fellow and an advocate from the United Kingdom?
Yes, so particularly my role as a fellow is one, to try to engage with people with Decade and let people know more about Decade. So a big issue is that people don't necessarily know about Decade, and the UK has obviously failed to, ratify not ratify Decade, sorry, it's just respect and to recognise Decade. So in terms of people knowing about it en masse, it's been quite a slow movement. And in terms of other human rights institutions like the National Human Rights Institution we have in the UK, we have seen the recent parliamentary report by the Joint Committee that national human rights mechanism that we have in the UK has not been serving Black people. So there was a real emphasis by that report that the Equality and Human Rights Commission hasn't been seen as an effective enforcer of Black people's rights, and that they need to represent Black people, in all levels of the organisation, particularly at the top levels. And they talked particularly around it not being fit for purpose when looking at Black people's rights. So in terms of being able to even celebrate Decade, even using those kind of mechanisms, that the institution itself is failing, is a failure. So if we're seeing that institutions that are created that are supposed to be looking at human rights issues and looking at how we can better protect them, even the so-called independent institutions are not able to do that, then in terms of people knowing about Decade, it would be harder for more people to know about it. So I have been, with my work, trying to raise more profile about Decade. So I have been able to have a historic motion passed in the London Assembly. The London Assembly unanimously passed a motion to formally recognise the Decade of people of African descent and to celebrate it. And I'm the first UK fellow to do that in the UK. So I've been able to at least get a lot more people knowing about Decade and actually trying to engage with Decade in terms of looking at localised levels, because I do a lot of grassroots community work. So my thing is always trying to see how I can do things grassroots, not necessarily waiting for the state, because we time and time again, state continues to be complicit and is actually just failing. So we can't rely on the state. So we need to see what we can do in tradition, in the continuing Black radical tradition, to do for self, as Marcus Garvey said. So in terms of creating spaces ourselves and seeing how we can resist ourselves, that's something I'm really particularly keen on. So I've been doing a lot of work in terms of letting the community know particularly about the Decade and how we can actually use the UN mechanisms to preserve and protect Black people's rights. So next month we're going to be doing some human rights training so we can teach some Black-led organisations in the UK about how they can use ISA and other special mechanisms from and special procedures from the UN to further protect Black people's human rights in the UK. So kind of to see how they can use the human rights mechanisms and tools to bolster their activism work, actually. So that's kind of what I'm looking to do. Just letting people and fulfilling the aims of this Decade as well in terms of justice recognition and development of people of African descent. But a key mandate of my work is to ensure that more people know about Decade, more people celebrate Decade, and more people work towards using the UN mechanism forums to support the work they're doing, ensuring they're showing up for Black lives.
That's phenomenal. And I think actually this is a perfect time, as you had started mentioning and speaking about kind of grassroots and local activism. Can you tell us a bit more about the two organizations you founded yourself?
Yeah, so the first one I founded was BLAM UK, stands for Black Learning, Achievement and Mental Health. We set up in 2017. And we literally do that, as we say in our name. So we show up for the Black community. We ensure that the racial esteem of young Black children, particularly, are being uplifted. A lot of studies have shown that Black children have low levels of racial esteem because of the ongoing racism that they face in society, and the anti-Blackness and the negative stereotypes around being Black. So for us, we do a lot of work in terms of ensuring that accurate narratives are being taught in schools around Black history. So we do teacher trainings in schools on Black history. We also go into schools delivering sessions on African history, Caribbean history, and Black British history. So ensuring that, again, authentic and truthful narratives about Africa and people African descent are being told in schools in the UK. We also know that in the schooling system, it's not only the fact that we're excluded from the school curriculum that's an issue, but also we, as Black children going through the school, are penalised for being Black. So what we see is that there is a disproportionate amount of Black children excluded from school. So if you're Black, you're 3 times Black, excluded from school. So we've developed an advocacy service. So we provide free advocacy for Black children in the UK. So any Black person living in London, that child is permanently or temporarily excluded from school, we provide free advocates to support them in accessing justice. We also do a lot of work around mental health and wellbeing in the Black community. So we've just launched just last year, September, Zuri Therapy, where we look at improving Black people's racial wellness. So looking at the effects of racial trauma, because we look at racism a lot, we don't actually talk about the actual harms to Black people's health, and how that shows up in everyday life, and how that shows up in anxiety or, increased levels of potential paranoia and things like that, because of the history of the historical traumas, but also the trauma of racism in itself and how it manifests and how it can internalize racism. So kind of looking at racism and how it affects us. And I think that's really powerful, because again, we just kind of talk about it as it being a bad thing. We're not talking about how it harms Black people. And I think it goes back to that stereotype that we've got a strong Black women, strong Black men, and this idea that Black people are superheroes and that we don't feel pain. And pain comes in different ways, emotional and physical. So I think it's really important in our quest to humanize Black people and actually take us back from that historical harm, which was slavery, which dehumanized us, is actually recognizing how harm shows up in so many different forms when it comes to looking at Black people's lives. So that's something that we're keen on. And then we also do our human rights project we're doing now. So we're supporting Black people making complaints to the UN Human Rights Council and other charter-based mechanisms as well. We also do work around in terms of preserving Black narratives as well. So we host events with intergenerational dialogue. That way we can kind of keep historical stories that are not necessarily mainstreamed within our own spaces. We create our own platform in which we can have dialogue with our elders and kind of continue that oral tradition, particularly very much alive in Africa, of preserving stories and keeping that storytelling tradition alive, and keeping our oral tradition and heritage alive. So we do a lot of work around that too. Oh, and Black Protest Legal Support is a second organisation that I set up, which we set up mainly because for 2 reasons. When I went to the BLM protest in 2016, I really saw that there were no legal observers when we were marching, and a lot of my friends reported back to me that they were seeing that people just being, mishandled by the police, being, victims of disproportionate force, arbitrary arrests, you name it. So I was determined that if we was to have another uprising like that in the UK, that we would, be able to have the observers on the ground. So when I saw that in the UK was going to have protests happening, I said that it's going to be fundamental and important that we have legal observers that can, monitor police interaction, provide an independent set of notes, and ensure people know their rights, their fundamental freedoms, and their rights are protected. So that was particularly important to us. And again, we know the Black community is over policed, so we know that our protesting is going to be the same in terms of being over policed, being met with, heavy-handed policing. So, and that's what happened. We saw that, crowds of people had horses charged upon them, serious violations of their human rights. So in terms of my work with Black Protest Legal Support was ensuring that we could have legal observers on the ground that could support people protesting for the movement for Black lives, and also ensuring that people knew their rights. So we had legal observers handing out bus cards, we had legal observers that were making an independent note of what's going on. And what was really unique about Black Protest Legal Support is that we are like the first legal observing group that's been able to get a mass amount of lawyers on the ground. So we had, on the first 2 days of the major protests in June, we was able to get over 100 lawyers on the ground doing legal observing work. and that was something really new in legal weapons scene in the UK. So that was something that we were particularly quite pleased about, in terms of lawyers showing up to support movements, the idea of movement lawyering, and actually lawyers working with movements to create changes that we want to see in the world. So the lawyers using their skills to support the movement. And yeah, so ever since, we've had legal labs at every protest, every BLM protest.
Wow, that's, yeah, incredible. And you must just be so busy. But I mean, it's incredible work. And, it's good to know that there are people engaging and doing it. So that's really fantastic. And I am so glad to hear about the work that the Black Protest Legal Support is doing, because I think that's, as you say, it's something that would obviously link, and that if, we are an over-policed community, then we're most likely to be an over-policed movement. And I think even I remember, it's not even that long ago, in 2018, 2017, 2018, when I moved to the United Kingdom, speaking to a Black British man, and he was like, oh, don't you know BLM is considered a terrorist organization in the United States? They're on the terrorist list by the FBI. So, and of course we all know the long history, at least in the American, and I'm sure in the British context as well, as probably just
in the
history.
UK as well.
Not,
Yeah.
they're,
Same.
Black Panther members were on FBI most wanted list. MLK was, and on and on and on. So
yeah, the UK, they have the Black Power Desk. The Home Office set up a
okay.
Black Power Desk to deal with any sort of Black activism and that stifle it. So what we saw was that there was an over policing and over Black radicals like Darkest How or Big Winner, and they successfully were able to create trumped up charges and disrupt movements by imprisoning our leaders, same what they did in America with Huey Newton and others, the New York Panther 21. So it was a strategic method to try and disrupt our movements by imprisoning our elders.
Definitely, there is a long history of it, for sure. So then I guess my next question for you is, what do you think is most important in local activism? What is important for you, or what do you think people need to be keeping in mind if they are engaging on a local level?
Yeah, so particularly for me, when I'm organizing around Movement for Black Lives, showing up for Black people, I am obviously aware that I'm a directly impacted person. So I come to the space as someone who's directly impacted. The lens in which I view my activism is that as a Black woman. So I bring my intersect, I bring my understanding to the space. So obviously, but not all Black experiences are a monolith. So I'm not going to speak for every Black experience, but I can speak for being a Black person living in the UK, a working class woman. So I do bring that into my activism. But I also think it's important, particularly for those of us that come to movements from a legal background or that have different skills, to be able to be ready to work with the movement and not try and come to the movement with sort of like a client lawyer relationship, that I know the law, I'm better and we should do this my way, but actually come to movements and be ready to learn with movements and actually see how movements want things done. And I think that's really important for anyone wanting to come into a movement, is actually coming to a space to serve the community and think, what are the needs? How can we show up for these needs, and what do I need to do to show up for those needs? I think having a needs-based approach and actually looking at what the masses of the community need and want, as opposed to what you think should be done. That's not how it should work. It should always be, how does what you're saying fit in with what the masses want? So I think that's really, really important in terms of activism. And I think it's really important to ensure that you're always engaged with communities, you're always on the ground with communities. You are, as I said, doing practical things. That if you look at a lot of studies, you can see a lot of areas in which things are disproportionately affecting Black people, things like food insecurity, things like cuts to legal aid, things like cut to benefits. When the woman rapporteur that came looking at rights of women to look on the CEDAW came to the UK, she talked about how the cuts to the state cuts to benefits disproportionately affect people of African descent women, because we are more likely to be in benefits. So kind of thinking about what kind of things are affecting who, and how you can create a service or a project that's working in tandem to solve that issue, but also working directly with people who are dealing with that issue. So having people that potentially are on benefits, within your leadership team. So thinking about how you can incorporate people and not just trying to use them as oh, come along and tell us about how things have helped you, but actually having young people, because we have our stuff is very much youth-led. We ask young people what they want, we work with young people. So ensuring that whatever project you're creating, it it's focused on the need, and you have young people or whoever the directly impacted group that you are specifically working with in terms of needs, is looking at a needs-based merit system, looking at them and saying, how is it that we can support you? What is it that you need? Being actively there and not trying to talk over, but talk with, to doing things with people that are directly impacted as opposed to for them, I think is really important.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think you had mentioned it too, just about client-lawyer relationship. And I wanted to then ask, I guess, how does your legal background inform your activism and play into it?
Yeah, so for me in particular, I try to use my legal skills that I've learned at law school, at undergrad, to show up for the community. So in terms of the stuff that we're doing, in terms of advocacy, in schools against school exclusions, in law school, I learned to draft, I've learned how to do legal research. So I'm just taking all the skills that I've learned in law school and seeing how I can use to serve my community. As I mentioned, lecturing on 3 times I like to excluded from school. So in terms of a lot of parents, there's no legal aid for education law. A lot of parents don't even know they have rights to, question a school when its exclusion is wrongfully done. They don't even know the education law. And again, because a lot of schools don't necessarily have anyone checking in or making sure they're accountable, they are getting away with unlawful and illegal exclusions. And also racial discriminatory exclusions as well. So unless people can know about the fact that, oh, there's a service that can help you if your child is excluded, and if the school's not following the guidance, there's someone that can help you, ensure that your child's rights are being furthered. Parents are so appreciative. So I think, kind of looking at what is going on and bringing my own legal skills to help train others within BLAM who may not come from a legal background, but sharing knowledge is important. Lawyers do come to the space, or who are legal background come to a space with some legal knowledge that not everyone has access to. So we can always share that knowledge with other people, and we can also train other people to do things that will help the communities in terms of drafting letters. Again, I said drafting submissions for school exclusion meetings, and using our skills and using our ability to read the law and to apply law to fact, and using that to help our communities, I think is so important. And again, for me, when I was doing my UN fellowship, I found that, because there was a few of us that came to this space as like lawyers, people with a legal background. So what I found is that when I was drafting complaints, like when we did tasks together as a team, or we did it individually, a thing that was really pointed out by those that were in charge of us, or those that were leading the fellowship, they were saying that particularly for me, they really saw that I had a good command of the law. So in terms of how I applied law to facts, they really liked that. So when I was drafting human rights complaint submissions or complaints to the working group people African descent, they were like, oh, we can tell that you have a legal background. So I do think that even if you're not necessarily working directly in the law, you're not going into court, you're not I'm not practicing as a lawyer, I'm not doing that, but your skills can still be useful in terms of ensuring people's rights are being upheld, that you can use your skills in so many other things. I think all too often we kind of wait to having to actually be a practicing lawyer to utilize our skills effectively, when you can utilize your skills in the community, and the community needs your skills. I think kind of not restricting our skills to one space, and actually thinking about how, before we have gone to practice, or before we are, actual like lawyers, like working, day in day in and out of the courts, how we can show up using our skills that we picked up at law school to support the community. I think that's really important.
Yeah. No, that's definitely, I think that's a really unique and kind of very interesting way to think about that, because I do think, as you say, time and time again, you hear people go into medicine or engineering or just generally any kind of traditional or contemporary profession with the hope of doing all these high, but it's not until I've qualified can they maybe start implementing or working for the change that maybe led or pushed them into a particular area of work. So that is definitely, I think, important to keep thinking about how you can use your skills and use them maybe not in the traditional way in which they've been used, or in the confines of where it's been demanded that they be used. That's really
Yeah,
fantastic.
it's about
Yeah.
decolonizing the space,
Yeah,
and
for
that's,
sure.
yeah, decolonizing language, decolonizing how and what should be done where, and kind of thinking about need.
Yeah.
How can I support people, and not necessarily being like I support people like doing this way, but seeing support as how I can directly help people's lives. What can I do? What can I bring to movements to support people, and not feeling so archaic in the mandate of this is the only way you can help people and this is it. No, there's so many different ways you can just skill to help people, and kind of going that I think is so important.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. And I know a very important part of BLAM's kind of mandate is mental health. And I guess I just wanted to ask, how do you protect and care for yourself and your well-being as an activist? And how do you, I guess, recommend that others who are engaging and working in these spaces, especially as directly impacted individuals, do the same for themselves?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of different ways people use for different things that people do in order to help them. For me, I'm someone that's Christian, so prayer helps me in terms of a way of being able to kind of just like have that sort of time away, time to reflect, time to just, just feel as though I'm not necessarily having to just be activism all the time, and actually having a space and time, quiet time to just reflect, moment just to reflect and just to adjust. I think that really helps me. But again, what we talk about in our zoo therapy is like idea of meditation, connection with spirituality, whatever you do, is it yoga, having something else that you do to kind of ground you is so important. So I think that's obviously one thing. I really enjoy reading, so I think that really helps me. And just having a really good, I think, friend and family network. I feel like for me, my friends and family are always, showing up for me. They're always, if what are you up to, what are you doing, it was checking on me, it was calling me. So I do think having people, we no man's an island. I think it's really important to invest in relationships with people. So I think, having, good relationships with people, and having people that you can talk to when you're feeling stressed out. Because, our therapists talk about like counselors that only come in the form of having a therapist. Like having a good friend that you can speak to is a form of therapy in itself, and not necessarily thinking that therapy is only confined to institutions. She was like, having someone you can speak to, someone that you can kind of wind down to, someone that can really, really help you just to kind of unweave. I think that's really, really important. I also think that, yeah, I think just having some you time. So like for me, I say like the weekends, no work. It's having like a strict sort of timetable, I would say, in terms of like when when are you gonna be doing work, and also just having some time to just enjoy. I think obviously it's hard in the lockdown, but for me, like I really enjoy watching YouTube videos of like makeup tutorials. So I just always do what I enjoy. So I think, just remember things that you enjoy, things that make you happy. And then I think having a balance of doing that and, not trying to internalize or having a burnout, knowing when you need to have a break, I think is so important, because I think we obviously are trying to push back in the system, but Audre Lorde talks about self-care is an act of revolution. So in a system trying to get you down, self-care is really important. I think having a strong self-care mandate, having some you time, and having time to relax. There's another really, really good Instagram and Twitter page I follow called Nap Ministry, which talks about the revolution will be well rested. So looking at things like that and actually thinking about how, in terms of a Black person living under racial capitalism, how rest is a form of resistance. Being able to relax and have peace is a form of resistance. Being able to dream and to, there's so much different ways in which we can resist. Like even Black joy is a form of resistance in a system that wants to make you, feel depressed about your Blackness and to internalize negative views about it. But having the ability to push back against that, that's a form of resistance. So kind of looking at resistance in a wide range of things as well, I think is really helpful. So that's the kind of things that I would say have been helpful for me in particular.
No, that's incredible. I know yesterday was Black Mental Health Day in Canada, and a bunch of my friends joked that they took it as a public holiday and did not work. And so definitely I do know the importance, but also the radical nature that can emerge when people actually, especially Black people, do take the time to rest and recharge, especially if you are kind of engaged in, I think, the very arduous work that is kind of local activism, especially, for sure. Yeah. I think then my next question is, how does one ensure that they are engaging in selfless activism, and how do movements and organizations, I guess, avoid being led by ego-driven activists? Because I think we've all attended, a BLM protest here and there where there's one charismatic person who's like, oh, we're not going to do that and we're going to do this other thing. I think weeks ago, I attended one in which the people wanted to basically go charge and barricade somewhere when, you know, the kind of formal organizers who their names were on the reports were like, that's not actually what we should do. And the police, of course, were like, if you do that, people are going to get arrested, and ensuring that, you know, people who are maybe trying to be the next Huey P. Newton and MLK were like actively trying to, not necessarily naturally falling into those roles. And I guess, yeah, just dealing with that, and ensuring that you are engaging in selfless activism, though is it ever selfless, because you are fighting for yourself and the rights of people that look for you like yourself. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because human nature is, you know, a big thing. It's a big issue in terms of egos, and, you know, even in spaces where people are meant to be creating liberatory visions of oppression, you know, thinking about liberation, human nature will come into play. So I do think it is difficult to police people's behavior, but I think obviously the thing that you can only really police is your reaction to their behaviors. I think finding spaces that are in line with your vision, in line with your view. From what I'm seeing, a lot more activism isn't necessarily about who's at the forefront, because particularly when looking at Black radical activism, we know that how our movements were easily able to be killed off once the leader was gone. So the whole idea of BLM being more autonomous is the idea that, you know, you can kill a revolution, but you can't kill a revolutionary. And you can kill a revolution, but you can't kill a revolution, sorry. So the idea of like revolutions living longer than the revolutionaries is really important. So I do think yes, obviously leadership is good, but kind of thinking about non-hierarchical leadership, thinking about, you know, co-ops, thinking about thinking about spaces that are not necessarily hierarchical, and kind of even decolonizing what we think as leadership, and actually having more community-led leadership. I think that creates a space of accountability. So I think, you know, kind of divesting from the idea of we need a leader and thinking about the idea that we are all part of this community, we are all directly impacted, so we all matter. So I think having a space in which we have much more of a decolonized view of leadership, and much more of a one could say like a Black anarchist sort of idea of leadership, I think that can be quite useful, and that can really help people not necessarily get caught up in leadership roles. I mean, there are people that are going to be more charismatic, and that's fine as well, but I think not necessarily caught up with the idea of I need to be a leader, because it's not about you being a leader, it's about direct change and impact that you can make. So I think it is important to kind of think about why we're doing this work. And I think, you know, you're not going to get along with everyone just because you're Black doesn't mean you're going to get along with someone. So I think that's also something that you should remember. And I think, you know, just finding your tribe, finding your people that you get along with, and then trying to organize around that. I think there's a lot of politics that goes on between like movements on the ground, particularly like protests on the ground. Different people feel different ways about it. Some people want to be more radical, some people want to be a lot more strategic. I think it just depends, but I'm not going to say that this one way is right. I'm not going to say this is how a movement should oppressed group should behave in this way to get cookies from the oppressor. Like, you know, I think, you know, do what you need to by any means necessary. But I'm also just cautious that you shouldn't necessarily force people to one viewpoint. I think it's just more about finding your tribe, finding your group, finding, you know, who fits in line with you, and kind of thinking about how you can divest from the idea of we need to have a leader. This is the leader, and think more about non-hierarchical structures. I think that would really help push against the idea of I need to be the next Huey P. Newton or whatever, because what we're seeing is the commodification of activism. So we're seeing it becoming a space in which people are capitalizing on activism. So it's not genuine anymore. It's more about, can I get a book out? Can I get my name out there? Can I get paid? And it becomes all about obviously you need to survive. I'm not saying people shouldn't eat, but that should not be the basis of activism. Activism should always be based on the community and community's needs. And if you get a book deal coming from that, that's great, but that should not be the forming arm of your work. That should not be what you are about. That is not what you should be. That's not why you should go into activism. You go into activism because you want to help people, not because of your own egoistic aim. So if you're going into space and it's all about you, then you need to check yourself and think about, why am I in this space and why am I doing this work? And I think, yeah, having more spaces that are non-hierarchical will keep people in balance as well. And I think, again, having certain texts that you read that keep you grounded, and also kind of looking at some of the pitfalls of our elders before us, looking at maybe the Black Panther Party and maybe where they may have gone wrong in some things, using that as a there's no excuse in 2020 with all the information that we have, in the age of information, to making the same mistakes as our ancestors or those before us. We have to do better, and we know better, so we must do better. I think kind of looking back at the past, as Sankofa Berg, part of the Dinka singles from in Ghana, looking back to go forward, to seeing what worked well and what didn't work well, and how we can use that to incorporate our activism going forward.
Definitely, yeah, that's, I think, a lot to think about and definitely important. You said a lot of really important things about it, and it definitely is. It's great that you touched on the idea of the commodification of activism, because I know that that's also definitely something that people grapple with, is how do we feel when activists are attending red carpets and the Met Gala, at least pre-COVID. Now they're not doing anything, no one's doing anything, but definitely, yeah, it is something to, I think, keep in mind and continue to engage with as we, I guess, figure out that balance that works best. You mentioned this briefly before, just about issues of intersections and how that kind of informs you. And so I was going to then more specifically ask, how does intersectionality inform your activism, and what do you kind of understand the term to mean in such a context, or in that context?
Yeah, so obviously the concept of intersectionality came particularly from Black feminists and Black feminist movements and Black feminist thoughts. I think it's really important to appreciate the scholarship that's come from them, and their work they've done around that. And I think intersectionality is actually ensuring that movements are, again, helping people's lived experiences. And there's no point in trying to make one truth fits all, because oppression is intersecting and it affects people differently. It will, a Black woman's experience is going to be different to a Black Muslim woman's experience, going to be different to a Black lesbian woman's experience. So in terms of intersectional ideologies and identities, will affect the way in which oppression affects us. And what makes us stronger is actually looking at how these intersects affects people, and then basing our activism around that. But what we have found, in particularly looking at like the women's movement, is that they created the idea of universal feminism that is just about sexism alone, when that's a universal experience just for white women. So it's the idea of trying to make one person's point of view universal when it's not universal. So I think that was really a big problem. But insanity came into space that actually, hold on, Black women are experiencing sexism and racism and classism. So we can't just organize under sexism because we experience racism from white women, and we can't just organize under Blackness because we were experiencing sexism from Black men. So it's the idea of actually kind of thinking about different people's point of view and actually not validating just one person's point of view, but taking into consideration that how certain history, but also ongoing legacies of history are affecting different groups differently, and also thinking about how in activism we need to be mindful of the fact that not one truth is all, and then thinking about how in certain ways we can support different groups and bring that into work that we do. So I think it is a really powerful way of seeing the world, and actually just constantly checking the privileges that we may have and thinking about others that may not have such privileges and bringing them up and seeing how we can support them too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that is, I think, yeah, that's definitely probably one of the better theories that has, I think I came across when I finally went to university. And of course, my worldview expanded from my little small town white curriculum. But yeah, it's definitely been, I think, a powerful theory. And I think it was really interesting to see kind of Crenshaw write that reflective article for Times discussing how, the term has been partially misused, but also how large it had become, and how that when herself and her colleagues kind of first coined it, they could not foresee where it would go 20 plus years later. So definitely is, I think, as you say, a powerful, I think, idea that they had attempted to encapsulate, for sure. So I think then my next question is, I guess, a bit more of a fun one that someone had submitted, which is, what are 5 books that you would recommend for those looking to engage with theories and concepts that inform anti-racism?
Yeah, so the book that I love and that really changed me was Assata Shakur's Autobiography. So that's like my top book for anybody to read. The way it's written, the concepts, the notions, the ideologies, and just she even has a really beautiful letter to Black people. And if I'm feeling a bit down or I'm not feeling happy or something's worked me up, I read that letter and it's like she's just speaking to me, and I love it. So definitely would recommend her book. In terms of other books that I've read that have been really powerful, I'm currently reading The Heart of Race, which is looking at Black feminists and Black feminism from a British point of view, and actually the history of Caribbean slavery and colonization and things like that come into play. So I think that's a really, really good book, The Heart of Race, if you want something from a UK point of view. Another book is Race Day Collective, which let me see if I have it on me next to me. The Race Day Collective book, which is, I have here, which is a really, really amazing anthology of, really amazing anthology of Black British organising in the 70s and 80s. And there's a journal called Race Day Collective, and it's lots of really poignant points. And what I really liked about them is that they were very Pan-African. So in terms of like their reach, they had people like C.L.R. James that wrote for them. You had Toni Morrison, really, really, really global reach, really, really Pan-African. So I really like what they have in there. And they also have a space called Creation for Liberation, kind of looking at the idea of Black joy through creativity. And so I quite like a lot of their essays, and just really allows you to kind of have a snippet into Black British life in the 70s and 80s and the kind of organising that was going on there as well. So I quite like that book. I also really like this book by Ife Thompson called Male Daughters, Female Husbands. And I really like it because it really showcases how women were like pre-colonial Africa, and how some of our societies weren't necessarily as gendered. So in terms of like having Black women that were in leadership, or Black women that were warriors, or the idea of like having to stay in a gender specific role wasn't, pronounced until colonization. And talks about how when the British came, they only gave power to men, and that really messed up the gender roles and the way in which the society was organized around. So I think that's really powerful. It's a really good piece of pre-colonial African history, because a lot of African history that we see now is only through a European colonial lens and nothing before that. So I think that's a really good book if you want to learn a bit more about African cultures and societies before European intervention. And my last book, I would say, is Pan-Africanism, A History of Pan-Africanism, which is a really, really good book, which talks about Pan-Africanism, its origins, Black internationalism, Pan-Africanism globally. So I think it's a really, really good text in terms of knowledge production and just the idea of Black internationalism, which we're kind of moving more towards at the moment, which is how it should be, and Pan-Africanism, which is how it was. So I think it's a really good book for anyone that's wanting to organise around the movement for Black lives and is thinking more about Pan-Africanism and globalised struggles. Is that 5?
Yeah, it is. And yeah, all
great
fantastic recommendations. And I noted them, and I'll definitely link people to them. And for anyone who is watching live and noted them themselves, remember to buy Black where you can and buy local, and also support your local libraries, especially with COVID-19. Many of them have lost their funding, and they're important community spaces, especially for working class, poor communities, and homeless individuals. So those are the three things I would say. If you're like, I have none of these books I want to buy, and don't buy from Amazon if you can avoid it. Buy Black, buy local, or support your public library. They would love to order it in for you to come and collect in the middle of a pandemic. So I just have 2 more questions for you that I guess are more about what we can be all doing going forward. And the first is, what are the ways in which we as individuals can engage more with the goals of the International Decade?
Yeah, so I think definitely going on the website, looking at some of the aims. They've got a whole section for the international community, and so I think definitely reading the program activities for people of African descent is a really good way of engaging with the decade. It talks about the idea of people planning activities to recognize the decade. So you could plan activity and the community or Zoom activity talking about recognizing such decade of African descent or celebrating it. You could also a big thing about a supporting initiative and projects aimed at honouring and preserving historical memory of people of African, doing events around Black identity and Black culture as a way of celebrating decade, because that's one of the key things to decade. Thinking about measures that can put in place in a workplace that can further support Black people is another as well. So yeah, I think those are like some of the key aims. But again, on the website, they do have some events. They've got a lot of literature on there. They've got a lot of reports they've written a report for women and girls. They've also written a report about racial profiling people of African descent. So using those reports in the work that they're doing, citing those reports, talking about decade is a really good way to celebrate it. And again, they have like different days. Like they had just in January they had Day of Afro Descendants. So celebrating the kind of dates, so looking at the dates that are on the UN calendar and seeing how you can celebrate certain days that would link in with the mandate. So I think that's definitely some of the ways that you can definitely get involved. Also, the working group of people of African descent, they do regular meetings and calls for intervention from civil society. So you can, write in and be involved in that. And again, reading their reports, citing their reports, and using that to form and understand and to formulate your work and understand some of the stuff that needs to be done in your local area as well. And working and supporting Black-led organizations as well is another way, and supporting them in their work and letting them even know about Decade, because again, not a lot of people know about Decade, so just letting them know about ways they can use to support their work. And then again, supporting physically, going to spaces, supporting them, using your skills to support small Black-led community organizations, nations and groups.
That sounds perfect. And I think leading from, as you had just said, supporting Black-led local organizations with is then how can people engage with and support BPLS and BLAM?
Yeah, so we're always looking for like legal volunteers to help on across our project. So if you just drop us an email, hello@blamcharity.co.uk. Our email's on our website as well. Can help us out in that regard. And then for Black Protest legal support, we are always looking for legal observers to help us. So it can be someone with a legal background or not with a legal background. Actually, we're open to just anyone that's passionate about supporting Black lives. We provide training as well. And if you go on our website, you can just press contact us and find out more about how you can become a legal observer as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me and joining us today, Aoife. It was really fantastic having you on. Everything you've said is just so insightful and interesting. I think you've given myself and everyone who has tuned in a lot to think about. And I'll definitely link the International Decades website and your charity's websites when we share on our other platforms, and hopefully people will engage. And really looking forward to seeing what you do over the coming years and months. And yeah, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been really, really great and insightful talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much.